Hi, thanks Joe for the introduction and for your help in making sure that this talk went ahead after the postponement from November. Thanks everybody for coming along as well. So if we begin by casting our minds back to June 2020, amidst the global Black Lives Matter action and protests, which turned out to be a time of reckoning and re-evaluation for many statues and memorials the world over. On the 7th of June, the same day that the slaver Edward Colston fell in Bristol, a petition went live calling for the removal of a stained glass window from the dining hall of Gonville Caius College Cambridge. The window honoured Ronald Aylmer Fisher, celebrated 20th century scientist and a former student, fellow and president of the college. The petition cited Fisher's views on race, especially his opposition to the UNESCO 1950 statement on race, which challenged the scientific legitimacy of racial classification. It also cited Fisher's eugenical views and his active involvement in the British eugenics movement between the wars, including, for instance, his prominent involvement in the Eugenics Society's ultimately failed campaign for the legalisation of eugenic sterilisation of so-called mental defectives. 3 weeks later, on the 24th of June, the college's council voted to remove the window. Similar reasons were cited by the Society for the Study of Evolution and the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies, who each renamed their respective R.A. Fisher Awards, and I've put screenshots of their statements there up on the slide. This kind of move, of course, chimes with recent decisions taken by University College London to rename campus spaces, which were dedicated to prominent eugenists Francis Galton and Karl Pearson. Now, it's fair to say these moves provoked mixed responses on places like Twitter, including the usual charges that history is being erased before our very eyes, and, of course, the warnings of slippery slopes. Where will it all end? The episode also prompted some prominent historians and scientists into print, again showcasing a mixture of responses. So on the one hand, we've had the historian of Nazi Germany, Richard Evans, writing in The New Statesman, arguing that it's right to think again about the ways we honour Fisher in light of his eugenical and racial views. And then more recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a piece came out in the genetics journal Heredity by several scientists, all of whom are members of the Fisher Memorial Trust, so no prizes for guessing their position on the matter. They suggest that on balance, the good outweighs the bad, and that we should therefore continue to honour Fisher. I'd like to make just one observation about this mini-literature, which has emerged since last June, and that's that by and large they employ roughly the same historical data set. That is, they discuss many of the same episodes from Fisher's career and give many of the same quotations from his work and correspondence. And yet they come to diametrically opposed conclusions or recommendations. Now, this, of course, reminds us of the important role of contextual interpretation in historical argumentation, but it also reminds us that these discussions about heritage issues, about memorialisation, and about commemoration are not straightforwardly solved by recourse to the historical facts of the matter. And I'm giving scare quotes there as I say it, in case you can't see. Indeed, there's an important irreducible role in these heritage discussions for values, those values which we presently hold dear and which we want to project out into the world. Now, with that in mind, and I hope I'm not disappointing too many of you here, my aim in the rest of this talk is not to provide the historical case for or against honouring and memorialising Fisher the man. As my title suggests, I want to take a long view, a look back at just some aspects of what has indeed been a long and drawn-out controversy surrounding Fisher's eugenics. So often in these, when these kinds of issues come to a head, it can appear as though they've come out of the blue from nowhere. So for much of the British public, for instance, I'm sure they won't have heard of Colston, never mind his slaving activities, before they saw his statue, toppling into the Bristol harbour. Now, Fisher's fall didn't make the same kind of splash, if you'll excuse the pun, But what's clear, certainly from the Twitter reaction and commentary, is that many young scientists and students of biology and statistics, people for whom Fisher is a recognisable and indeed a revered name, were previously unaware of his eugenical views and activities. As we'll see, these facts have been long known to historians of science. What I want to do is zoom in on the moment when they became known to historians of science, when this revelation of Fisher's eugenical views and activities was new, was fresh, and was a controversial talking point among historians of science. And this will involve going back to the 1970s. We'll focus on how this revelatory discovery was made and what it meant for historians of science and the uses to which they put it. We'll see that they forwarded the historical claim that Fisher's commitment to eugenics in various ways shaped, influenced, and motivated his science. These kinds of claims in turn provoked a certain amount of critical response, as we'll see, particularly from Fisher's former students and his scientific disciples. We'll look at their counters to these historical claims, and I'll suggest that we can see these interventions in the historical disputes as part of their larger aims of rehabilitating, securing, enhancing, and in other ways curating Fisher's legacy. It's a good example, I'll suggest, of these issues of history and heritage running together. Finally, I'll try to draw some lessons, or at least interesting questions, I hope, thinking a little bit about how the 70s, 80s discourse compares and contrasts with the kinds of conversations going on over the last 9 months or so. Okay, so back to the 1970s, and in particular this 1977 article in New Scientist magazine by British psychologist Max Hamerton on what he calls a fashionable fallacy. Now, he's talking here about historical writing on the sciences, and he says that he notices an increasing tendency to attribute changes and advances to a mysterious but almost omnipotent entity called social and economic factors. This nicely sets the scene in terms of the friction between two apparently oppositional approaches to understanding the sciences historically. On the one hand, internalism, an approach which Hamerton talks about with a certain amount of nostalgia. He says it's now widely considered to be quite out of date and indeed in some quarters pernicious. So internalists are interested in telling stories about the development of science which don't refer to anything outside of the science itself. It's a story of science propelling itself forward through its own methodology of experimentation and testing and hypothesis. And on the other hand, challenging internalism is what Hamerton and many others at the time refer to as externalism. And that's a way of approaching the sciences historically, which refers to these social and economic factors and indeed other factors, which in some way have determined or influenced the development of science from the outside. And this view, Hamerton suggests, is held, he says, because the Marxist faith demands it. And so Hamerton's histrionics here about the Marxist faith give us a sense of the politicised flavour of this methodological divide. Indeed, it's been shown in detail by several scholars how in many cases the embrace and the dominance of internalist historiography in the immediate post-war decades was linked to Cold War anti-Marxism. On the internalist account, science was the pure pursuit of objective truth, untouched and unsullied by grubby political or ideological concerns. And this picture of science came under increasing pressure from the late 1960s through the 1970s, with increasing enthusiasm among historians for an externalist approach. Now, one proponent of this approach, the young historian of science Bernard Norton, then finishing up his doctoral thesis on British statistics around the turn of the 20th century, was moved to respond to Hamerton's article with his own contribution to New Scientist, titled A Fashionable Fallacy Defended. Now, he provided two case studies. One, the psychologist Cyril Burt, who had recently been posthumously disgraced by accusations of fiddling his data. And the other, in significant contrast really, was the esteemed geneticist and statistician Sir Ronald Fisher. No whiff of disgrace surrounding Fisher at this time, and thus his case study was all the more powerful for it in some ways. So what he says about these two case studies is that we have here examples of the path of science being strongly directed by social factors, and moreover, that there are reasons for supposing that such cases are not untypical. Now, the social factors he's talking about here are commitment, an ideological commitment to eugenics, to racial improvement. And he says that Fisher worked as he did because he was an ardent eugenist. Now, there are two things that I want to emphasise at this point. Firstly, the way in which Norton was positioning eugenics as an external factor. He was far from alone in doing so. Since World War II and revelations about Nazi atrocities carried out in the name of eugenics, the movement had lost much of its prior popularity and credibility, and certainly its status as scientific. It was routinely dismissed as pseudoscience or as ideology masquerading as science. Historian of eugenics Diane Paul has observed that historians working in the 60s and 70s, on both sides of the external-internal divide, agreed that eugenics, quote, pertained to the context of science, not its content. So, hence, as a subject for historical investigation, it belonged to the externalists. The second thing to stress is the way that Norton framed knowledge of Fisher's eugenics as a revelation, a novel discovery with wide-ranging ramifications. In a strong sense, it was just that. Fisher was highly active within the Eugenics Society in the interwar years, but he withdrew from the society in the later 1930s and formally resigned in the early 1940s. This, incidentally, wasn't due to a change of heart about eugenics, but rather reflected his misgivings about the leadership and the direction of the society, the increasing role of social reformers and social scientists in the society's leadership to the exclusion of biologists. After the war, Fisher ceased publishing on eugenical activities, and steadily his prior eugenical activities were to some extent forgotten, intentionally or otherwise. They barely show up, for instance, in the obituaries and tributes which followed his death in 1962. By the 1970s, Fisher was attracting increasing attention from historians of science, in large part focused upon his role in the making of the so-called modern synthesis. Fisher's role in these narratives was a heroic one. He was routinely credited with the reconciliation of Darwinian natural selection theory on the one hand and Mendelian genetics on the other, and thus laying the theoretical foundations of modern evolutionary studies. But whilst Fisher's name appeared ever more frequently in the history of science scholarship, there was no mention of his eugenics. Indeed, why would there be? In good internalist fashion, these historians stuck to the scientific content, not its social or ideological context. So Norton is presenting this as news. Incidentally, just a few months later on in 1978, the first biography of Fisher was published, written by his daughter Joan Fisher Box. And Box goes into great detail on Fisher's youthful eugenical enthusiasms, but she doesn't mobilize that information to make the same sorts of claims about it shaping Fisher's science in the way that Norton does. In any case, from 1978 onwards, Fisher's eugenical commitments are well known once more. So how was this revelatory discovery, the way that Norton presents it, how was this discovery made? Well, it's in some ways a good old-fashioned archival discovery. So in the middle here we have Donald Mackenzie, who in the early 1970s was a graduate student at the New Science Studies unit at the University of Edinburgh, famous or infamous, depending on your methodological persuasions, as the seat of the Strong Programme in the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, or SSK. Mackenzie was inspired by the growing literature which sought to demonstrate the influence of eugenics upon science. And he asked in his doctoral research what that influence had been in the case of British statistics in the decades around the turn of the 20th century. During a 1974 visit to the London offices and library of the Eugenics Society, he happened fortuitously upon this document pictured on the left, the minute book of the Cambridge University Eugenics Society, which detailed its activities during its short existence in the second decade of the 20th century. Now, the minute book revealed the young Fisher, a mathematics undergraduate at Cambridge in the early 1910s, as a central figure within the Cambridge Society. He was co-founder and a regular speaker at their meetings. And this was a very different Fisher than any historian of science had conceived up until this point. Mackenzie alerted his friend Norton to the minute book, and over the next few years, the two embarked upon a series of radical rereadings of Fisher's career and his scientific contributions in light of this revelation concerning his deep and early commitment to eugenics. So what did their claims look like? On the right here, I put up the cover of Mackenzie's 1981 book, Statistics in Britain, 1865 to 1930. But notice the decidedly sexier subtitle, The Social Construction of Scientific Knowledge. So he's wearing his methodological heart on his sleeve here, and this book is conceived and presented overtly as a contribution to the strong programme brand of SSK coming out of Edinburgh. The book includes a chapter-length study of Fisher, wherein Mackenzie puts forward a double claim. Firstly, that he says, there seems little doubt that Fisher's involvement with eugenics was of crucial importance to his choice of scientific career. So we've got a claim here about ideological motivation dictating what Fisher chooses to work on, pushing this mathematician into biological research. But then we get the more SSK claim, because SSK is not only interested in the extent to which social factors dictate the direction of research, but also the very content of the scientific knowledge that is produced via that research. So Mackenzie argues that Fisher's work in biology was strongly connected to his involvement in the eugenics movement. Similarly, Bernard Norton forwards a similar double claim. So he says that Fisher's entrance into biological work was consequential upon his espousal of eugenics at Cambridge, and indeed was shaped by this interest. For both, the Cambridge Minute Book plays a key evidential role in showing Fisher's deep and early commitment to eugenics, something which they argue pushed him, a mathematician, into biological research. Now, how did it actually shape the content of his work, this second aspect of their claim? Norton began with a reinterpretation of one of Fisher's most celebrated contributions, his 1918 paper on the correlation of relatives on the supposition of Mendelian inheritance. Now, this paper became highly celebrated for many reasons, not least its demonstration that the observed continuity of biological variation within populations was compatible with a particulate Mendelian scheme of inheritance. This demonstrated the compatibility of the two and was taken to be extremely important in the making of the modern synthesis. Norton argued that this focus on the 1918 paper's role in the synthesis had distracted from its other achievements, in particular Fisher's attempted demonstration that only a tiny portion of observed biological variation could be put down to environmental influences. In other words, Fisher was trying to show that nature dominated over nurture. And to the extent that he was successful, this, Norton pointed out, was grist to the eugenist's mill. This was a boon to eugenists because improvement in the quality of the population could only therefore come about through selecting the best stock, rather than through, for instance, environmental, social, or educational reform. No wonder, Norton suggests, that the research which culminated in the 1918 paper was encouraged and financed by Major Leonard Darwin, then president of Britain's National Eugenics Society. Mackenzie and Norton also set their sights on Fisher's famed book of 1930, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, lauded as a foundational text in modern evolutionary studies. And they offered, in some ways, new ways of reading and interpreting the text in light of this new knowledge about Fisher's eugenic commitments. Now, I've put up the contents page just so we can get a feel for what's in the book. Looking on the left-hand page at chapters 1 to 7, we see discussions of Mendelian inheritance, of natural selection, of genetic dominance, sexual selection, mimicry in butterflies, all topics which we today would categorise unproblematically as biological. From chapter 8, Fisher turned his attention to human societies and civilizations. Now, what Norton and Mackenzie did, firstly, was to suggest that we understand these human chapters as being eugenical in their aims and their content. Now, this can seem fairly obvious to us now, and indeed historians of science have long been in the habit of referring to the genetical theory's eugenical chapters. However, when we look at the text, Fisher never actually uses the term eugenics to describe what he's doing in these chapters. And just as historians before the mid-1970s were seemingly unaware of Fisher's involvement in the eugenics movement, or at least not interested in it, they also didn't seem to see these chapters in a eugenic light. So take, for instance, Will Provine, an important historian of population genetics and the synthesis. When writing about the genetical theory in his 1971 book, he gave an exhaustive exegesis of the early chapters, but then dealt with the final 5 in a single sentence, saying simply, quote, "In the concluding 5 chapters, he, Fisher, extended his genetical ideas to human populations." There's also a nice example in a 1984 letter from historian of science Garland Allen to the biologist and historian of science Ernst Mayr, where Allen says that he's flabbergasted to realise how long it took him to realise that the second half of the genetical theory was what he called an apologia for eugenics. How many times, he says, I had read it without realising this connection. But once the connection was made, it took on a life of its own. So by the end of the 1980s, we have historian and philosopher of science Michael Ruse writing the following. He says, "One does not have to have an Edinburgh accent to think that Fisher is fertile ground for either historian or philosopher. In one man, we have a perfect case study to test all sorts of theses about the ways in which culture and values can get into straight science, and conversely. If you doubt what I say, you need only look at his seminal The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, the first 2/3 of which creates modern evolutionary theory, and the last third of which is full of helpful hints about keeping up the human breeding stock." Similarly, we have a similar quote from historian and philosopher of biology Sahotra Sarkar, writing in 1992, and he says that in the case of Fisher, a general consensus seems to have emerged. Fisher was deeply interested in establishing the continuity of his scientific and his, as Sarkar euphemistically puts it, philosophical views, and usually tried to argue that the latter were directly entailed by the former. Indeed, it does not require any special insight to see that Fisher saw deep connections of this sort. Even his seminal Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, a book ostensibly devoted to evolutionary genetics, the last 5 of the 12 chapters are overtly devoted to eugenic issues. So a decade after Norton and Mackenzie are first putting forward these radical claims about the influence of eugenics on Fisher's science, they'd become something of an orthodoxy, and the genetical theory came to be a sort of shorthand, a microcosm of these science-ideology relations. But whilst Sarkar talks of a consensus, Norton and Mackenzie's claims did in fact come in for severe criticism, especially from scientists with personal connections to Fisher. So first we have here a quote from a review of Mackenzie's 1981 book by Anthony Edwards, an accomplished geneticist and evolutionist in his own right, who was a student in Fisher's genetics department at Cambridge in the 1950s, just before Fisher retired his professorship and relocated to Adelaide in South Australia. Now, Edwards Edwards writes, this is in response to Mackenzie's claims, Fisher's eugenics, and indeed the whole of his views on the interaction of genetics and human society, manifest in the later chapters of the Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, are rooted in his science and not the other way round. Fisher is not good material for sociologists. Edwards's remark was itself met head-on by Norton, who in a 1983 paper of his wrote that, quote, eugenics was the dog that wagged the tail of population genetics and evolutionary theory, not the other way about. So I read that as a kind of response, actually, to Edwards's claim. And then we have the following from Australian geneticist John Henry Bennett, who again worked at Cambridge at the genetics department under Fisher, before returning to Australia and taking a position at Adelaide, where Fisher would spend his retirement and final years. Bennett writes that all the evidence from Fisher's published work, his biography and his correspondence shows, I believe, that his biological interests were primarily in natural selection, secondly in heredity, and that from these stemmed his interest in human heredity and eugenics. Recently, however, several writers have proffered a different view of Fisher's priorities and aims in his biological work based upon a sociological or ideological approach. Here he names Norton and Mackenzie. I hope the contents of this volume will help readers in judging the weight that should be given to these different views. Now, my initial inclination was to simply view this back and forth as an instance of externalist and internalist approaches to the history of science coming into conflict. But whilst that lens works to some degree for Norton and Mackenzie, it seems to miss something when thinking about the likes of Edwards and Bennett. Their misgivings, as far as I see it, are not with Norton and Mackenzie's methodological stance per se, but really with the choice of their target. Indeed, we should see their critical responses to Norton and Mackenzie's work in context as part of Bennett and Edwards' larger and wider and more general aims of rehabilitating, preserving, and enhancing the legacy of their scientific hero. So looking briefly at Bennett, he worked tirelessly campaigning to have buildings at the University of Adelaide named after Fisher, establishing student prizes in Fisher's name, these being the more obvious memorialisation activities. But he also oversaw the organisation and cataloguing of Fisher's personal archive, which is still held at Adelaide. And he compiled and edited Fisher's collected papers, ensuring that his work was available and accessible to later generations. And he also edited 2 volumes of Fisher's selected correspondence. And these endeavours served to preserve and, he hoped, to enhance Fisher's legacy. And in the case of the volume of correspondence, the materials were judiciously selected, arranged and interpreted in order to shape the narratives of Fisher's legacy. And this was clear to see for those who read the 1983 volume of correspondence. So, for instance, Garland Allen, who we met earlier, reviewed the volume in ISIS and wrote the following. He said that especially welcome to many historians of science will be the light the correspondence in this volume throws on the question of whether Fisher's entry into statistical population genetics was motivated by questions in evolutionary theory and genetic theory themselves, or by the social concerns of eugenics. Indeed, one of Bennett's purposes in making the particular selection of documents for this book was to elucidate this dispute. But it wasn't only these controversial claims over Fisher's ideological motives which were at stake here. It was also ideas and narratives about the character of the man, Fisher. And so David Finney wrote to Bennett upon reading the proofs, and Finney was a fellow disciple of Fisher and a follower and fan of his scientific work. And he observed that Fisher is so often spoken of as an aggressive and quarrelsome type, and I'm sure that you're at least as well aware as I am that he could be exceedingly difficult. Nevertheless, I do not think that anyone could read the letters you have put together and continue to think of him as a great brain inside an unpleasant personality, which is clearly the impression that some of our American colleagues unfortunately have. So it's a rehabilitation job across the board. not just on the matter of Fisher's eugenics. If we look briefly to Anthony Edwards too, he's long been highly committed to securing and enhancing Fisher's scientific reputation and legacy. He's published a great number of historical pieces on various aspects of Fisher's life and work, and what unites many of them is that part of their argumentation is driven by the idea that Fisher has in certain ways been systematically misunderstood, overlooked, or underappreciated. Edwards himself became a fellow of Caius College in the early 1970s, and he was very much the driving force behind the installation of the Fisher window in 1989. I've got a picture up here of the original proposal for the window, which Anthony kindly shared with me. So now we've come full circle back to the window. We can end with some final reflections. Now, one of my main aims in this talk was to give some backstory and some context to the recent discussion over Fisher's legacy. And what I've provided is, of course, incomplete. So my focus has been on conversations around his eugenics and much less so on conversations around his views on race, which have been at the forefront of recent conversations. But what I think we've seen is the extent to which the separate issues of history on the one hand and heritage on the other have been run together in the discourse surrounding Fisher, not just now, not just recently, but throughout the history of these conversations. In the examples that I've given, I've suggested that we can see Bennett and Edwards' interventions in the historical discourse as part of their larger projects of commemoration, memorialization, and the curation of Fisher's legacy. What about Norton and Mackenzie? Well, it's clear, I think, that their historical claims about Fisher were not related really to concerns of heritage or legacy. Fisher, for them, was a particular case study mobilized towards making a broader point about the nature and the social relations of science. Now, I'll finish with a half-baked thought, and I'd be really keen for input on this. So looking back at the 70s and 80s discourse, what really strikes me is the kind of key role of scientific boundaries and quite rigid scientific boundaries at that. So on all sides, it seems, Norton and Mackenzie and Bennett and Edwards, and as well very much the quotes we saw from Roos and from Sarkar, there are instances of imposing their contemporary boundaries. So we have eugenics, politics, society, ideology grouped together on the one hand, clearly separated from science on the other, and the book, The Genetical Theory itself, becomes a kind of microcosm for that quite strict divide. Chapters 1 to 7, the science. Chapters 8 onwards being the politics, the ideology, the eugenics. And so when you look at the dispute between Norton and Mackenzie on the one hand and Bennett and Edwards on the other, both sides seem to be agreeing on where the science proper ends and where the ideology begins. Their disagreement is over the causal influences between these two comfortably separate spheres. So which way the causality lies, in essence. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, it's my sense that these are just the kinds of boundaries, the boundaries between science and non-science, between eugenics and science, between science and politics. These are just the kinds of boundaries which historians of science since the 1980s have taken great satisfaction in deconstructing and in historicizing. And so, but the problem we see when we come to the kind of present and the recent conversations, particularly manifest in the pieces I flagged up at the beginning, the Evans New Statesman piece and the Bodmer et al. Piece in Heredity, and really the discourse more generally on reevaluating eugenicist scientists, is these boundaries between science and non-science, between science and kind of ideological context, are very much taken for granted and are very important in these conversations about reevaluating scientists from the past. And so my question really is about how do we as historians of science, who are kind of interested in not simply imposing our contemporary boundaries, but rather in kind of excavating and historicizing the evolution of the boundaries of science. How do we involve ourselves in these conversations when, certainly for me, when I'm reading a lot of the kind of discourse, I'm a little hesitant to get on board with the way in which the kinds of get on board with the language that's being used of influence from outside of science to inside of science. So that's the kind of ending thought that I wanted to finish with and hopefully get your input on, because it's something I'd like to develop more in future. So I'll stop there and I'll say thanks very much for listening and say that I'm very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, for that presentation. This is the point at which I'd like to re-invite folks to send me the questions, any questions they might have via the chat function. While those are rolling in, I'd like to kick things off by asking Alex if you can elaborate a little bit on really the question you raised at the end. You had some reflections on what sorts of insights historians can bring to these contemporary debates about memory and commemoration, as opposed to, but in relation to historical expertise. I'm curious if you think that there's anything distinctive about the history of science there. The fact that we're talking about questions from the history of science versus questions more generally. History of slavery, history of race, history of politics, culture, economics. Is there something distinctive about how historians of science navigate these sorts of issues?
That's an excellent question, and one that. So I've always felt in my, I guess, short career as a historian of science, but I've always felt that there does feel to be something a little bit distinctive about what we do, and it's in some ways related to a conversation that you and I were having privately before we started this meeting, to do with I guess history of science feeling in some ways institutionally and historically a little bit separated out from general history. And I think part of that is to do with the kind of our collective reverie for science and as seeing science as something apart from culture, and really a kind of legacy in many ways of what I was trying to summarize earlier on in the talk about this Cold War ideology of science as a kind of purely objective and separate sphere from culture. And I guess the problem we perhaps have is, as historians of science, the problem that we're, and I'm afraid I'm not giving answers here, I'm just kind of further pointing out the problems. The problem we have as historians of science is the disjunct between, I guess, public history conversations and more scholarly conversations within our field. I was talking about this the other day with a colleague. The extent to which in my own work I'm interested in, like I said towards the end, excavating the shifting boundary between, say, eugenics and biology, or between science and non-science, and the extent to which those boundaries are being constantly negotiated and altered, don't seem to fit very easily with the way in which public history conversations about science particularly with eugenics, scientific racism, for instance, the way in which those conversations occur, which seem to take a fairly often, and this is a generalization, seem to take a fairly static view of what is internal to science and what is external to science, and kind of taking our current understanding of that, projecting it onto the past, and kind of showing, look, here we have something which is politics, something which is external, impinging upon science, and thus distorting it or kind of sullying it in these ways. And those are powerful stories, and they're the kinds of stories which people are very interested in reading for obvious reasons. And they're the kinds of stories which often are brought out when we're talking about things like the Fisher window, when we're talking about things like Galton and Pearson buildings at UCL. We talk about kind of the distortion of science by ideology. And I guess what the challenge facing historians of science, perhaps, is to move that conversation in a different direction, where we can talk in these public spaces about the shifting boundaries of what is taken to be science, and doing so in a way that is, I guess, in step with what we think is the right historiographical approach these days, and not kind of falling into or falling backwards in some ways to kinds of approaches which we've moved on from, perhaps methodologically, but also doing in a way that doesn't excuse or doesn't kind of say, oh, well, it doesn't matter that Galton was held these political ideas, because that was part of acceptable science in his time. It's not simply a matter, I think, I don't know how to kind of to toe that line, basically, is what I'm saying. Is I want my kind of history of science to be able to speak to these issues, but I want, when I am speaking to those issues, I don't want to have to compromise on my kind of historiographical approaches that I'm doing in my scholarly work. So again, it's just raising problems and perhaps trying to clarify the kinds of problems I was trying to raise in my conclusions of the talk. Does that kind of speak to what you were talking about, Joe?
Yeah, I think actually this feeds nicely into the question that Corinne has asked, Corinne Maguire, who asked you to reflect a little bit more on this discussion of boundaries and to extend your point about Fisher's dissolving the borderline between the biological and the social. And so the question is this a contemporary separation but more slippery? In the interwar period, did Fisher see this as a boundary?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that in my own work I've been trying to do, is to almost take these the kinds of remarks that I was giving from Mackenzie and Norton, and then from Roos and Sarkar, take that as a starting point and say, and draw attention to what it is they're doing rhetorically and historiographically. Certainly in the Roos and Sarkar examples, they're drawing this very clear distinction between the first half of the genetical theory, for instance, which they say is, creates modern evolutionary theory, is what Roos says, and Sarkar says that the first half of the book is ostensibly about evolutionary genetics, and that's in contrast to the second half of the book. Now, Fisher himself tries to in the preface of the book, he says that the deductions respecting man are wholly inseparable from the more general chapters. So he's trying to say that this is all part of the same conversation, that there is no boundary between his biology and his extrapolations concerning man. And so in that sense, there's no boundary, or at least he's trying to downplay the existence of that boundary within his own work. But what we see when we look at how readers receive his book is that from the very beginning, right from the off, people are reading it as a book of two halves. And so people are in reviews and kind of early readers in the 1930s are seeing these things, these different aspects of the book, as distinct. Now, what's particularly interesting about that is that it's not always spoken about along the lines of different disciplinary discourses, for instance, but really in the terms of the audience for these chapters. So when people are reviewing this book, they're saying the first 7 chapters are really hard for people who aren't biological specialists, and indeed people who don't have the mathematical capabilities to follow along with Fisher's reasoning, because it is a highly mathematical text. But the more general reader can nevertheless get a lot from this book, because they can just turn to chapter 8 onwards, and this stuff is much easier to follow, doesn't require mathematics. They're not saying the early chapters are science and the later chapters are kind of political. They're saying the early chapters are specialist and the later chapters are more general or generalist. And this kind of 2 halves reading of the book is in place throughout the century and up to today. But what's interesting is the ways in which the nature of those 2 halves and the relations between them changes over time. And it's once we get to the 1970s, we get this argument that the latter chapters are not science. The earlier chapters are strongly scientific, and that the very presence of those non-scientific, indeed ideological or political chapters, the very presence of them should cause us to reinterpret the first half of the book as science sullied by ideology in some way. What Fisher tries to do very much is to present them as one, as to present it as a continuous text. But the extent to which he's successful in that is very disputed if we just look at the way in which people read it. I've answered that through the lens of the genetical theory. Purely for those who didn't quite realize, it's because my dissertation is about this book in particular, and so I've come to a lot of these issues through the lens of looking at the reception and reading and legacies of this particular text. I hope I spoke to your point there, Corey.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, I have a great list of a queue of questions to get through. I just want to make a quick note that if anybody has to leave at 4, as I'm aware some people might, and you have a question that you'd like to get in before then, let me know, and I'll see if I can slot you in before 4 o'clock. But until then, I have a question from Jim Secord, who asks, how does the radical science movement, as told by Gary Werski and others of the late 60s and early 70s, fit into the story? They did not accept this internal-external division, but rather looked to what Bob Young termed a common context. What did they have to say about Fisher?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for that. So the radical science movement does certainly play a role. So we have people like, so for instance, Donald Mackenzie, his kind of route into science studies is he goes along to a meeting of the Edinburgh chapter of the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science, and members of the science studies unit are there, and so Mackenzie does his undergraduate studies in mathematics at Edinburgh, and then kind of learns of the existence of this field of science studies, which he comes into very much as an activist. He's a political radical. He's an activist, and he sees his science studies scholarship as continuous with taking a political stance in these issues. And I'm glad that you draw attention to the kind of the rejection of this dichotomy, because certainly when we read, if we read Mackenzie's work, he doesn't use this language of internalism versus externalism, to the same extent that, for instance, Bernard Norton does. Bernard Norton uses this language very much in his writings. He's, in some ways, he does so with the zeal of a convert, because if we look at Norton's earliest writings in the early 1970s, he's not very much interested in social context or these kinds of factors, but rather in telling stories about methodology or competing methodological approaches, and indeed the metaphysics of the different scientists involved. But then through the mid-1970s, as far as I can understand it, under the influence of Don Mackenzie, he has a bit of a historiographical conversion, and he, whether Mackenzie would have been criticizing for him for this or not, he very much takes up this language of externalism. And I think, so even though Mackenzie is of the school of thought of rejecting that language, and indeed rejecting the dichotomy which it seems to uphold, I think that actually quite a lot of his remarks, going back to his work, do seem to play upon that dichotomy to a surprising degree to me, given what I know about his kind of how he is seen and how his scholarship is seen. So I'd say that he's possibly not following through methodologically on the promise of doing away with those dichotomies, but certainly it's Norton that is much more using and employing that language. And then finally, in terms of the, I forget what the final bit of the question was. Oh, just what are they saying about Fisher? Well, curiously absent from, or relatively absent from, Werski's work, I guess. Fisher wasn't part of the club, of course, of the people that people that Werski's looking at in the 1930s, your Haldanes, your Hogbins, etc. Indeed, he's kind of an adversary of theirs. And what I'm interested more and more is looking at those conversations that actually take place between Haldane and Hogbin and Fisher in the 1930s in terms of their differing politics, and kind of definitely inspired by Werski. So that's playing a role in my own work, for sure. But yeah, I'll finish there so I don't ramble on too much more.
Okay, great. Next we have a question from Richard Staley, who says, you gave a chronology that inverted the chapter order of the genetical theory, or at least mixed it up. Fisher's eugenics came quite early, and his statistics were in part about boundaries between nature and nurture quite early. Might you be able to use that to think about making interrelations and boundaries at the same time?
Well, so I think chronology has been one of the main issues in these conversations that I'm looking at in the 1970s and 80s. Something which I didn't really go into was Edwards and Bennett pointing out, well, you say that the eugenics comes first. Well, no, indeed, it's Fisher's Darwinism which comes first. Fisher, as a young man, as a schoolboy, indeed, when he wins a school prize at Harrow, chooses the collected works of Charles Darwin as his school prize, and he cherishes them for the rest of his life, and he takes them with him to Cambridge. So he's a Darwinian before he's a eugenist, and so this suggestion comes to say, and kind of backs up the claim that we saw, that it's the inherently biological and therefore scientific interests which are primary, and so eugenics is a secondary interest, or a kind of extrapolation from the biology. I would again kind of talk about, or I would respond to that again by getting us to think about boundaries and think, for us, we tend to think of, Darwin as very squarely scientific. It's, that's impeccable credentials scientifically. If you're early introduction to the biological topics is through Darwin. But if we look at the way that Fisher reads Darwin and the way that he talks about Darwin in his early eugenical writings, Fisher thinks that Darwinism and eugenics are closely linked, or at least they sort of entail one another. And so the chronology is an important aspect to some degree, but I think we can get ourselves into traps of kind of pigeonholing, well, Darwin, that's biology and that's science, and then the eugenics is the eugenics, when for Fisher they were kind of very much continuous with one another. Thinking about more specifically the chronology in the case of the chapters of the genetical theory, that becomes an even more kind of interesting story, because there's a kind of standard account of Fisher's writing of the book, and it's that he sat down, or rather he was standing, his wife was sat down in late 1928 and into 1929, and he paces around his home dictating the book in its entirety to his wife, who takes it down by dictation, and the whole book is written in a feverish kind of few months from late 1928 to 1929. And this is kind of this story is trotted out time and time again, and it's kind of part of the Fisher mythology, because it kind of reveals something of his singular and peculiar genius, that he was able to just kind of allow this book, this text of genius, to flow from his mind. It evokes kind of images of the disembodied intellect, the disembodied genius. But in terms of the actual gestation of the text, there are issues with that story, not least the fact that in the Fisher archive in Adelaide, there's a manuscript, a run of 3 chapters, which he wrote in 1919, which bear a very striking resemblance to the final 5 chapters of the genetical theory, or at least a portion of them. And indeed, in many cases, they are repeated verbatim in the 1930 chapters. And so he begins writing the book, or a book, in 1919, gets 3 chapters in, shelves it, and then in 1928, he tries again to write a book, and he revisits this manuscript, presumably, and pulls out and incorporates a lot of it into these final chapters. Whereas it was a freestanding manuscript on his theory of human civilizations, that's how he conceived it in 1919. By 1930, he's kind of incorporating it as the final chapters in a manuscript, which also includes his genetical writings and his thinking on natural selection. And as I mentioned earlier, he uses his preface to kind of suggest the continuity of them. But it begins as the final chapters aren't this kind of extrapolation that come about in 1929, thinking, oh, well, what are the ultimate ends of this genetical work? Because he does start writing that book before he starts writing the genetical theory as we know it. So chronology certainly gives us a lot to think about in the book itself. And I think that previous commentators on the book, without knowing of this 1919 manuscript, have fallen into the trap of thinking that the order of the chapters suggests to us the chronology of its gestation and of its and indeed of its authorship. So I've just kind of I've jumped on the word chronology there and just spouted some thoughts on it. I hope some of what I've said spoke to your concerns there, Richard.
Okay, we have a question now from Robert Budd following up on Jim's question. And Robert asks, do you think Norton was really talking about externalism, or was he explicitly challenging the drawing of boundaries around science? I seem to recall him being pleased that he could show that the emphasis on large populations in statistics came from the eugenic ancestry of stats. But the early 1970s, by the early 1970s, the terms internalism and externalism were quite old-fashioned.
Well, yeah. So thanks for that. And I think that this is what I keep hearing and what I keep reading and seeing is that really by even the early 1970s, this kind of discourse is old hat, and so any kind of historian worth their salt wouldn't be explicitly cashing out their claims in these externalism versus internalism ways. The kind of, so Norton does use this language in some of his publications, and especially in his doctoral thesis, but he often does cash things out in this language, and I don't know whether it's just it's a convenient language for him, and it's kind of as it is a convenient language, or at least a convenient rhetorical strategy within public history or science history journalism today. We still see these kinds of use of relatively strict boundaries between science and non-science. And I think eugenics is a particularly tricky case because it's not clear what exactly eugenics is or was. When we think about, was it science or was it something that was non-science? And the category of eugenics goes through, it's constantly spoken of as a pseudoscience or something akin to that. And so I don't think it's a clear-cut example of an external factor. Certainly not all historians of eugenics in the late 1960s and 1970s did talk about it like that. Some did. So Kenneth Ludmerer, for example, important book on the American eugenics movement in the late 60s, explicitly writes in the preface and introduction of his book that looking at the eugenics movement is an excellent example of the influence of external factors upon the internal development of science, because eugenics is an ideological commitment, but it shapes the direction and the content of biology, and so you get a kind of real range of the ways that people are talking about this, but it is certainly on occasion they're using the language of externalism. And my reading of Norton is that he, at least on many occasions, does use that right into the second half of the 1970s, by which time it's supposedly this outdated language that nobody uses anymore. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Okay, so we have a question next from Michael Baraney, who asks, to what extent has the reevaluation of Fisher interacted with the reevaluation of eugenics over the same decades? In particular, the shift in localization in scholarly emphasis between the US, UK, Germany, other, and the changing view of eugenics as a particularly separate and awful science versus a very multifaceted science that continues to influence economics, biology, statistics, etc. How much can different communities' valuations of Fisher be correlated to their different views about what eugenics is?
That's a really rich question. What comes into my mind at first when I hear that question is that Fisher is a very important figure, not because within kind of the changing conceptions of what eugenics is and how we should think about it historically, not because Fisher is the most evil of the eugenicists or even the most effective of the eugenicists in bringing around eugenic reform or whatever, but because of his very stature as a scientist, who is a kind of this very, very leading figure across many fields. And so that's why I kind of hinted at this distinction between Cyril Burt, the psychologist, on one hand, as one of Norton's examples, and Fisher on the other. And Norton plays on this distinction. A most esteemed figure, he calls Fisher as the kind of subtitle before he talks about him. The power of the Fisher case study is Fisher's very stature within science. And you see it when you look at writings from the 1970s and 1980s after Fisher's eugenical interests become known. You see it history of eugenics writing, Fisher thrown in as this kind of example of, well, it wasn't all, crackpots and charlatans and kind of fringe people, second-rate scientists who were into eugenics. It was the real first-rate scientists as well, and Fisher is often used as the kind of shining example of that, a really first-rate scientist who's nevertheless involved in eugenics. And so that's, I would say that Fisher is important in kind of in that shift of thinking of eugenics as this ridiculous pseudoscience to something that's actually in many ways very scientifically sophisticated and, as you say, continuingly influential. On the local question, I would have less to say, and because so if we think about what we're talking about, 1977, 1978, really, British eugenics is kind of one of the key focuses of the eugenics historiography at this time, and Fisher just kind of adds to that growing momentum of scholarship in British eugenics. But I might have been kind of missing a cue to talk about something there. But thanks, Michael. That's a really rich question.
Okay, we have a question now from Rainer Alexandrovich, who's a psychologist teaching statistics at an Austrian university, who says, interestingly, you talked for half an hour about Fisher without mentioning the concepts of likelihood or probability. It took me quite a while to understand this concept. I'm not sure whether I did. To me, what may be considered as my community, Fisher was one of the most stringent mathematicians, solving century-old problems formerly known as inverse probability and putting it into a solid mathematical fundament. And this was only one of his most important findings. Now, being a psychologist, it seems to me that we should consider his way of looking at things as well. Him being a Darwinist, having developed further a convincing tool to separate structure from randomness, that is probability / likelihood. It appears to me an understandable approach to explain statistically eugenic ideas. You mentioned Edwards, who also wrote a seminal book on likelihood. Hence, it is not surprising that Edwards also defended Fisher because he fully comprehended the radical approach. Shouldn't we take this aspect into consideration as well? Like, as in, to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, rather than subsuming it under the vague umbrella term science.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the kind of conclusion there of that very nicely put question. I would say is the approach you want to take, and I've kind of tried to suggest, the unhelpfulness of these strict boundaries and these large capacious categories, such as science. And so, I would absolutely encourage us to kind of break that down and to think about not only what science is to Fisher, but what it is to be scientific and to study something in a scientific manner is to Fisher, because Fisher was very thoughtful on these issues and was very well equipped to kind of intervene on these issues. We only have to think of his things like his 1925 book, Statistical Methods for Research Workers, which went through many editions, was incredibly influential in kind of tooling up field workers and field researchers on how to apply statistical methods to their research. He also had a book, The Design of Experiments, which did similar things for experimental design and the analysis of the data you get from that. And so what Fisher is providing a toolkit on how to make one's research scientific by his own standards of scientificity, should we say. And certainly Fisher doesn't often reflect on the nature of science in his early career. He does much later when he comes to write on scientific inference, for example. But in the kind of few reflections he does have from his earlier portion of his career, he's clearly of the opinion that what science is not about its content or subject matter per se, but on the methodological approach that you take to that subject matter. So he thinks that different domains of study can be made scientific by taking a scientific approach, and part of that is in the kinds of statistical methodologies, but also in the kind of pursuit of identifying causal relationships which one can intervene in order to bring about a desired result. And so that's why I guess eugenics for Fisher is scientific, because it is about identifying causes, causal relations, and intervening in them in a kind of measured way and a predictable way in order to bring about a desired result. That being, in his particular case, the preservation of a kind of level of civilization and kind of arresting what he saw as the decay of civilization. And that's why I think in his genetical theory he tries to kind of cash this out in the language of science. And so I don't have anything specifically to say about inverse probability, but I mean that it just made me think more about Fisher's kind of statistical activities, which is a whole rich side of him, which I didn't really get into in this talk.
Okay, next I want to pass along a follow-up from Richard Staley, who says, one of the possible ways of bridging the two halves of the genetical theory might be by thinking about the arguments he makes about fertility in the two different sections. Were they similar or different in character?
So they are of a piece in his general. So fertility plays a very important role within the book as a whole, because fertility plays a very important role in Fisher's conception of natural selection, which is what the book as a whole is really about. So by the time that Fisher was writing his book, it was increasingly common for natural selection to be thought of in terms of differential survival. So this kind of competitive war, this struggle for survival. And Fisher was quite relatively unique in the emphasis that he put on differential reproduction as the kind of the really important driving force of natural selection. And so that's something which I think unites the first and second half, if we want to talk about it like that, of genetical theory of natural selection, is his interest in reproduction and fertility. Certainly when he's developing in chapter 2, he's developing his famous fundamental theorem of natural selection. He does so through thinking about reproductive capabilities. He develops it from his Malthusian parameter, which is a concept that he develops in a eugenical, or rather in an article in the Eugenics Review. And so there is certainly a continuity in the fertility and reproduction angle. But I want to think about that more. It's not an emphasis that I've put on in the way that I've thought about the book. So yeah, that I'm gonna take that down and think about it more. Thanks for that, Richard.
Just if I quickly follow up on that, one of the reasons that I thought of it is that I noticed that one of the chapters deals with the question of social fertility. And it looked to me as though he might be making an argument that in human society, fertility can be managed. So this might be one way in which eugenics becomes important for his thought.
Absolutely, yeah. So he's very much, I mean, the management of fertility is, oh yeah, what I should say, and what kind of, I realize I didn't go into in the talk, is fertility is unusual in Fisher's hands because he argues that it is heritable. So fertility is a function of our kind of literal physiological capabilities to reproduce, but also our decisions about whether or not to marry, when we marry. If you delay marriage, there is less kind of window for producing offspring, etc., these kinds of issues. Also our decisions about whether or not to take up contraceptive options available to us. All of these factors which go towards kind of conditioning our fertility. And Fisher says, as a package, that is all heritable. So not only the physiological side, but also these kind of decision-making sides. He thinks that our reproductive decisions are dependent upon our kind of temperament. He talks about temperament, and he thinks that those underlying temperamental kind of persuasions that we have are themselves inherited. And so once fertility is heritable, then fertility is something which can be acted upon by natural selection. And so that's how he thinks that we can kind of put in process a selective process that increases the fertility, or rather balances the fertility, because at the time that he was writing, he thought that the fertility of the lower classes, lower social classes, was kind of disproportionately high, and that of the upper classes was disproportionately low. And this was a problem of their inheritance as well. Whereas most people at the time considered it in terms of these being kind of socially conditioned, and if you rise socially, then something about that new social environment causes you to make different reproductive decisions. Whereas for Fisher, it was a function of your heredity, which is idiosyncratic to him, at least at the time.
So I have now reached the end of my question queue. If there's anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question who would like to do so, this is your chance to pipe up. Ludmilla.
Right. Thank you. I thought that was absolutely wonderful, and I couldn't think of a way of saying this quickly in the chat function. So there are a couple of things. I think thinking about rhetoric and rhetorical context would be really helpful, because part of the reason why boundaries move is because they're doing different kinds of work in different cultural settings. So I think an analysis of how scientific rhetoric works, especially, I mean, Fisher's part of that sort of post-T.H. Huxley, but very much Julian Huxley era, where there's so much of this stuff around, and there must be some rhetorical patterns. Anyway, that's just one idea. But the other idea, if you will forgive me, I'd like to put a slightly different slant on what you're saying about the internalism, externalism thing, because obviously I was around then and working on evolutionary theory and interested in the reputation, in my case, on Lamarck. So I think what was wrong with internalism and externalism wasn't that it was old hat, it was that it didn't do an intellectual job. And the intellectual job it didn't do was to speak to the nature of mediations. And I think a lot of the emphasis of what people were trying to do in the 70s and 80s was trying to show precisely how different kinds of ideas social, political, economic, literary. I mean, think about Gillian Beer's work, actually get welded into scientific practices and ideas. An internal external doesn't do any of that because it's dualistic. So I think it's about models of the relationships between ideas and practices.
Thanks, Ludmilla. That's really useful. So yes, I think mediations is perhaps going to be a very useful term then, because like I've mentioned in response to a couple of other questions, I think that the internal external boundary does play a role within the work of the figures that I'm looking back at, but we are very much looking at a moment when, like you say, we're moving away from this dualistic way of thinking about things. And yeah, so is if I can kind of counter, is mediations, is that what people were saying at the time? If you can possibly, that's what it was. Right, okay, that's useful.
Sorry, it's mediations because it does indeed come out of a Marxian framework. And I think you probably know that several of us who are on this call, Jim, for example, was involved in a meeting last year to think about the work and legacy of Bob Young. And there are going to be a number of publications coming out of that. And I think that will help us understand some of the environment. And I know Jim also has something in press. So right, I think it actually was quite explicitly mediation. And I think you can't really talk about that in reductive terms. You have to try and engage with some of the, I don't know, for want of a better word, cultural complexities.
That's really helpful, and I look forward to seeing those pieces come out. That'll be really helpful because, yeah, I am interested in this. You know, we have this internalism, externalism discourse that then disappears, and yeah, I'm interested in following that story through and seeing, you know, what conversations take over. And so that sounds like it'll be very helpful. And just, yeah, what you said about rhetoric is yeah, absolutely the way that I'm kind of beginning to explore these things and want to explore further in my future research, and kind of, yeah, trying to place Fisher's writing within this kind of milieu of, like you say, the Huxleys, etc., and the way that people are writing about science and its relation to wider life and culture in the 1930s in Britain. So yeah, that's absolutely part of it. So thanks for that.
So we're coming to the end of our scheduled time, but we do have room for maybe one more question if anybody else would like to sneak one in. Yeah, Greg.
Well, what a thrill, Alex, for all of us to have a chance to be reflective about these topics in this way, thanks to your seminar. So on behalf of all, I just want to say thank you. And I wish I had a better formulated question to pose at the end, but I'll give it a shot anyway. It seems to me, importantly, and especially in the ways that you invited us to think about the 1970s and 80s in relation to the controversies in 2020, 2021, to reflect a little bit on the, you know, the element of provocation in pointing out that someone was a eugenist or eugenicist or whatever term. That was true in the 1970s and 80s. In some ways, it's even more true now. And I don't quite know what to do with that when it comes to the attempt of people like us to be reflective about all the ways in which one doesn't want to draw boundaries between the scientific and something else. It's almost as if there's this irresistible gravitational pull, so that even someone like Bernard Norton, who you beautifully brought out, kind of has his head turned by through the course of the 1970s. Even he is drawn back. You documented in his New Scientist exchange, right, to this language that he otherwise rejects of the internal and the external. But there just seems to be something about eugenics in particular, but I'm sure there are other examples as well, where it becomes that much harder to be reflective, thoughtful in the ways that we would like to be. But it does seem to me that's an important, one shouldn't lose sight of that they were, when Norton writes that piece in response in The New Scientist, he's very much aware of flinging down the gauntlet.
Very much so, and I mean, if you, I didn't include it, but if you look at that, if you look at the article, Norton says, now of course eugenics will be familiar to many people as through its associations with Nazi Germany. You know, he drops the Nazi Germany in there. He doesn't at any point suggest, you know, Bert or Fisher were Nazi sympathizers or that they were kind of egging on the Nazis and what they were doing, but he drops in the association. And so it's going back to what Ludmilla said about rhetoric. And I think that this is something that people are studying is, you know, the E-bomb, eugenics, as kind of this rhetorical move that we see kind of almost, it's an argument ender, isn't it? But that, you know, if you think this, then you must think this, and that is eugenics, and that is kind of conversation over, in the same way as this kind of famous phenomenon in internet forums of, oh, well, if you think that, then you're Hitler, you know, and it has this kind of rhetorical clout, and it carries with it all of these, you know, this huge amount of cultural baggage and cultural associations, so that it is very difficult to have conversations that get beneath all of that. And so what I guess the task is then to kind of tell the story of how rhetorically those packages came together and how they began to be mobilized in these ways, and tell a kind of historical rhetorical story about that. But yeah, it's that's the situation we're in. And it means that these kinds of conversations become very charged from the outset, and that is a fact of the matter.
Yeah, we've reached the end of our scheduled time for today. I'd like to thank everybody for a wide-ranging, interesting, and provocative set of questions to put to Alex, and Alex for a stimulating talk and for responding to those questions so illuminatingly and engagingly.
Thanks everyone for the questions. Yeah, loads of stuff to think about, and yeah, thanks for coming along, and thanks again to Joe for organizing and sharing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.